I wasn't in a good place that fall, and that's about as polite as I can make it. I was 49, bent over diesel blocks all day, and living like a man who had mistaken routine for healing. In the shop, I trusted torque specs, timing marks, and the clean click of a calibrated wrench. At home, I trusted a microwave clock that blinked 12 o'clock, because I never bothered setting it after the last outage. My wife, Anna, had been gone 2 years, and in those 2 years I had gotten very efficient at not feeling much. Work, freezer meal, shower, bed, repeat. I told people I was keeping busy. Busy is a useful word when the true word is lonely. My son, Caleb, lived 40 minutes south and might as well have been in another state. We weren't fighting. That would have been honest, at least. We had settled into that quiet men can hide inside, where texts are practical and short, and never ask the one question that matters. You good? Yeah. You? Fine. I had trained him in that language without meaning to. He grew up watching me solve problems with tools and silence, and after the funeral, we both did more of what we already knew. He didn't come by much. I didn't ask him to. Some nights I stood at the sink with a plate in my hand and tried to remember what his laugh sounded like in the house, not through a phone speaker. At 6 each morning I drove out while it was still dark, took County 18 past the feed store, and unlocked Bay 3 before the younger guys rolled in. Diesel work suited me because engines don't lie. If fuel wasn't atomizing, you found out why. If compression was low, there was a reason. No engine ever sat on a milk crate and told you it was fine, while quietly coming apart. That week I had a logging truck in pieces, injector sleeves spread on a clean rag, and my hands moved by habit while my mind wandered to a cedar parcel 21 miles up the mountain that had come to me when Anna died. Her aunt had left it to her years before, then to us, then to me. I hadn't been back since the week after the funeral. By Thursday, sleet was showing up on the weather radio, and the fence line at that parcel was probably half down from fallen limbs. I heard myself tell Mason, my shop foreman, "I'm heading up there for the weekend. Check in on Saturday if I'm not back by dark." He wiped grease off his knuckles and gave me a look that held more concern than curiosity. "You want company," he said. "Roads are going to get slick up high." "I'll be all right." "You keep saying that like it's a plan." I shrugged. "It's what I've got." He nodded slow, then said, "Take chains, and call your boy Ray. Don't just disappear into trees and stubbornness." He said it plain, no sermon in it, and that landed harder than I wanted. I muttered something about being fine, loaded my toolbox, a maul, fencing staples, 2 cans of soup, and a dented green thermos into the truck, and drove home to pack before daylight ran out. My house sat at the edge of town where the pavement gave up, and gravel started. The blue heeler, June, met me at the door with that old dog sideways wag, whole rear end working harder than the tail. She was grey in the muzzle now, one ear bent from a long-ago fence incident, and she watched me like I made sense, even when I didn't. I talked to her while I packed, because there was nobody else to hear me. "All right, supervisor," I said, tossing her blanket into the cab. 2 days, maybe 3 if I break something dumb. You can judge all my choices from the passenger seat like usual." She huffed and hopped in before I finished. Loyal and opinionated, both. The drive up took an hour and a half because I went slow once the road narrowed. Late autumn mountain country has a way of making a man feel small without trying. Fir needles slicked the ruts like wet paint. Fog pooled in the ravine and spilled across bends in pale sheets that moved like breath. Every culvert ran loud from last night's rain. The higher I climbed, the quieter the radio got, until it was only static and a weather voice cutting in now and then with freeze warnings and wind advisories. June kept her nose near a cracked window, taking inventory of deer scent, cedar, mud, and whatever else mattered to a dog. The parcel gate leaned where the bottom hinge had rusted out, and I had to shoulder it open. The cabin sat another quarter-mile in, tucked under old cedar and hemlock, roof patched but holding. Anna used to call it our splinter palace because every surface there had a nail waiting to find you. We fixed it in stages over 10 years. New stovepipe, reinforced porch, proper gutter on the north side. She painted the inside trim cream and said dark wood made winter feel longer. I hadn't seen that paint since the day we carried boxes out after the service, and stepping onto that porch felt like stepping into a room where someone had just spoken, and then gone still. I carried in the first load and stopped at the open breaker panel by the door. Her handwriting was still taped beside it on blue painter's tape. Neat block letters with arrows. Well pump / water heater / porch light sticks. Tap twice. 2 years and the tape was still there, edges curled but stubborn. I stood with my glove in one hand and read it 3 times like it might say something new. June circled once, laid down by the stove, and watched me decide whether I was staying. My throat tightened the way it does when grief comes up sideways and practical men pretend it's allergies. I set the bags down, went back outside, and sat on the porch step longer than made sense. The cedar boards were damp through my jeans. A towhee scratched in leaves near the rain barrel. Somewhere down slope, a branch knocked lightly against another branch in the wind, steady as a metronome. I poured coffee from the thermos cup, found it gone lukewarm, and held it anyway, because the heat in my palms gave me one simple thing to focus on. June pressed against my knee. I scratched behind her ear and talked to the trees like they were old mechanics leaning on a fender with me. "Don't start with me today," I said quietly. "I came up here to fix fence, not feel things." That got me a look from the dog that could have been pity, which I did not appreciate. I finally stood, tapped the porch light switch twice for no reason except muscle memory, and got to work because work was what I knew. I walked the north boundary with a bundle of stakes and found 3 posts down, 2 wire runs slack, and 1 section crushed where a fir limb had come through. Mud sucked at my boots. Cold rain started and quit and started again, the kind that never commits to being a storm, but soaks you anyway. By dusk, I had 1 run tightened and my shoulders barking. I split a few rounds for stove wood, though half of them were too wet to catch easy, and by the time I went inside, my hands had that deep ache that comes from honest labour and middle age. Night up there wasn't dramatic. It was quiet in layers, drip from the eaves, stove ticks as metal expanded, wind moving high branches while lower trunks stayed still. I heated soup, tore bread, and sat at the small table where Anna used to spread seed catalogues every January and plan a garden at a property that barely had enough sun for tomatoes. June snored near the stove. I stared at the opposite chair and ran through all the things I had not said while there was still time to say them. Not grand things, daily things. I should have listened better. I should have stayed in the room when you were hurting instead of fixing shelves in the garage to avoid watching. I should have called Caleb the week after, and not waited for him to figure out his own grief while I hid in mine. I slept badly, woke twice, and once found myself standing in the doorway before dawn with my coat half on, like my body expected me to leave before morning, proved I'd stayed. Fog sat low between the trees, and the whole clearing looked softened at the edges, as if the mountain had decided not to press me so hard for a few minutes. I poured yesterday's coffee into a small pot, reheated it on the stove, and drank it black while June patrolled the porch and then came back to sit against my shin. I remember thinking this was what my life had become. Me, a dog, a list of repairs, and a silence I'd started mistaking for strength. Around noon, the weather shifted colder. I hauled fencing wire to the east side and worked the line above the ravine, where old logging ruts cut the slope like scars. The ground there held water in long, shallow pools, and every step made a wet, sucking sound. I talked out loud to keep my mind from drifting. Count staples. Keep wire level. Watch your footing on the downhill side. June moved ahead and back. Never far, her ears relaxed, tail level. Once she stopped and looked into the timber for a long few seconds, then looked back at me and trotted on. No hackles, no warning growl. Just attention, then calm. By late afternoon, I was spent. The kind of tired that reaches behind your eyes and turns your thoughts blunt. I stacked tools under the eave, covered the woodpile with a tarp that did almost nothing, and stood there with rain beading on my coat, listening to water run off cedar boughs in soft streams. It occurred to me, not for the first time, that I had come all this way to mend wire and avoid one phone call. The realization sat heavy and plain. I could rebuild a transmission by memory and still had no idea how to call my own son and say, "I miss you, and I don't know how to do this right." When dark came on, it came fast. I lit the stove, fed June, and ate standing up at the counter. The cabin held that mixed smell of wet wool, old pine, and metal heat. I caught myself glancing at the breaker box note every time I passed the door. Her handwriting, not mine. Small evidence of a life shared in practical marks and arrows. I touched the edge of the tape with one finger, then pulled my hand back like I'd reached toward a hot manifold. Outside, the rain eased to a mist, and the mountains settled into that deep, listening quiet that can make a man feel either held or very far from home. That night, sitting on the porch with my coat zipped to my chin and June leaned against my boot, I wasn't sure which one it was. June lifted her head first. 1 second she was warm against my boot, breathing slow, and the next she sat up straight and aimed herself toward the trees beyond the clearing, ears loose, posture alert in that calm, working dog way that meant she had noticed something worth cataloguing. I followed her line of sight. The mist had thinned to threads drifting between fir trunks, and the last of the evening light had gone from grey to charcoal. What caught me was not a sound, but the lack of one. No towhee in the brush, no little rustle of mice in leaves. Even the drip off the eaves seemed to pause between drops, stretched farther apart than felt natural. I stayed on the step longer than I meant to, cup empty in my hand, feeling my own breathing get loud in the quiet. June did not growl. She did not edge behind me. She just sat and watched, tail laid easy on the boards like she was waiting for a truck to come around a bend she already knew by engine note. I told myself it was weather pressure, cold front sliding down the ridge, animals bedding early. I had heard whole woods go still before storms plenty of times. Still, I stood up and walked to the porch rail and scanned the tree line until my eyes watered from trying too hard in the dark. Nothing moved, nothing broke silhouette. After a minute, June gave one soft huff, turned, and lay down again at my feet, as if the matter had been reviewed and filed. Inside, I latched the door, checked the stove, and set my wet socks near the heat. The cabin had its usual night noises, but thinner, like someone had turned the volume down on the world outside and left only the small interior clicks of settling wood and metal. I ate another bowl of soup and read half a manual I had tossed in my bag out of habit, though I couldn't have told you what page I stopped on. My mind kept drifting to the dark, beyond the porch light, and that odd pocket of hush. I told myself, in plain terms, this is what isolation does. You spend enough time alone and ordinary quiet starts feeling personal. I had seen men in the shop jump at air hoses when they were tired and grieving and trying to act normal. I wasn't exempt from human wiring just because I could set valve lash by feel. Sometime after midnight, I woke to June shifting off her blanket. She padded to the door and stood there, not scratching, not whining, just waiting. I slid out from under the quilt, pulled on my coat, and opened the door a crack. Cold air came in clean and damp with cedar and wet soil. June stepped onto the porch, sat at the edge, and looked left toward the woodshed, then back to the trees. I listened hard and caught a soft, wooden touch, like one stick set against another. Then silence again. Not a crash, not clumsy movement, more like deliberate placement. It could have been wind. It could have been a branch settling under meltwater. I waited long enough for my hands to go numb, saw nothing, and came back in. June followed without fuss and lay down, chin on paws, as if she was satisfied with the inspection. At dawn, I woke to pale light through the kitchen window and that heavy, damp cold that sits in a cabin until a fire takes hold. I fed the stove, poured old coffee into the dented pot, and stepped out to check the tools I had left under the eave. That was when I stopped and stared long enough for coffee to slosh over my knuckles. Beside the door, where I had leaned a few wet rounds and cursed them for being useless the night before, sat a neat stack of dry kindling. Not merely drier than average wood, dry enough that the cut faces looked pale and thirsty, as if they had been stored under cover for weeks. Every piece was wrist-thick, even length, bark trimmed clean in a way I would have called tidy if I were complimenting a new apprentice. I touched the top piece. Cool, dry, light in my hand. I looked up at the roofline, the tarp, the woodshed, ran through inventory. I had no hidden stash there. I had brought soaked rounds and impatience, nothing else. I walked around the cabin twice, boots sinking into mud, checking for tire tracks or footprints from a neighbor's quad. Any practical answer I could tighten down like a loose clamp. Nothing obvious in the churn near the porch besides my own prints and June's. She sniffed the stack, sneezed once, then sat beside it with the same relaxed attention she'd given the trees the night before. No alarm in her. No stress. I laughed once, short and dry, because my brain offered me 3 explanations, and none of them fit worth a dime. I even said out loud to a dog and a pile of kindling, "Well, Ray, you once apologized to a stump in heavy fog, so maybe don't appoint yourself chief witness yet." I lit the stove with that kindling. It caught on the first match, quick and bright, no hiss of trapped moisture, no smoke back. Real dry wood, real present tense heat in a cold room. The simple usefulness of it hit me harder than it should have. Somebody or something had done work that made my morning easier and asked nothing. That did not line up with how I had come to see the world these last 2 years. My prevailing model had been more transactional. If help came, it came with a story attached, a favor owed, a debt quietly entered in a ledger. This was just there. I drank coffee at the counter and kept glancing at the door like I might catch an explanation arriving late. I spent the morning on fence repair with June, shadowing me through wet grass and aldersuckers. The mountain stayed under low cloud, and every branch held droplets bright as solder beads. I drove staples, tightened wire, reset one leaning post, and found myself less sunk in my own head than I had been the day before. Every few minutes I scanned for signs of other people. No fresh truck ruts near the gate, no chainsaw noise from adjacent parcels, no voices carrying through timber, just creaks running high, and the muted clink of my pliers against metal. Around midday, June halted again, this time near the upper corner where the boundary cut back toward an old logging spur. She stood with one front paw lifted, ears forward but soft, then turned to me and wagged once, slow, like she was acknowledging someone beyond me. The brush there was still, not tense still, resting still. I walked over, squinting through vine maple and cedar trunks, and felt that same odd thinning of ambient sound. A jay called once downslope, and then went quiet. I waited, expecting the usual chain reaction of small noises to restart, and when it didn't, I caught myself holding my breath. Then, somewhere deeper in the timber, I heard measured movement. Weight placed, released, placed again with remarkable care. Whatever made it moved big but not reckless, stepping as if it knew exactly where each branch lay and did not want to snap what didn't need snapping. June stayed beside me, body loose, tail level. She looked up at me, then back toward the sound, and sat. That got my attention more than anything. A healer that had spent 10 years warning me about coyotes, strangers, and one memorable mailbox had just decided this was not a threat worth barking at. I worked until the light began to flatten, then hauled tools back toward the cabin. At the porch, I set my boot down and paused. Right where my front tire usually rested when I parked tight to the step, sat 2 smooth river stones, crossed in an X, and tucked under them was a fresh cedar sprig, green and fragrant, beads of moisture still clinging to the needles. The stones did not belong to this patch of ground. We had clay, roots, fractured shale, not creek-rounded rock. Somebody had carried them, arranged them, not tossed, arranged. I crouched and studied the placement like it was a mechanical failure pattern, and I could reason backward to cause. No scuff marks nearby, no little kid boot prints, no prank carved into bark. Just that simple marker in a spot hard to miss and impossible to call accidental. I stood up slowly, feeling my chest tighten in a way that wasn't fear exactly. It was more like the first deep breath after holding one too long. For months, maybe years, my internal script had been set to absence. If I dropped something, it stayed dropped unless I picked it up. If I was cold, I warmed myself. If I was lonely, I swallowed it and kept moving. Looking at those crossed stones, I had the brief, disorienting sense of being seen from outside my own habits. I did what I always did when emotion got close. I argued with it. Could be a neighbor cutting through. Could be some old hunter's marker I never noticed. Could be me losing track of what I set where, which at 49 was not flattering, but at least available as an explanation. Yet even while I ran that logic, another truth sat beside it. Whatever this was, it was careful. That evening I drove down the spur a mile to where I could catch one shaky bar of signal and called Mason from the truck. He answered on the second ring over compressor noise. "You still in one piece?" he said. "Yeah, fence is half done. Road's greasy but passable." "Copy, you sound weird." I found dry kindling under the eave this morning, after rain all night, and some stones set by the porch. He was quiet a beat, then gave a short laugh. "Either you got a mountain elf with a work ethic, or one of the reeds is messing with you." "No reed tracks by the gate." "You sure you're sleeping?" "Not much." "Then sleep first and solve mysteries tomorrow. Also eat something with protein, not just soup in a can." "I had jerky." "Ray, that does not count as a meal and you know it." I smiled despite myself. "Heard." His tone softened. "You need anything, I'll come up. Don't get proud on me." "Thanks, I'm okay." He let out a breath that said he didn't fully buy it, but he let me go. "Call again in the morning." Back at the cabin, I fed June, ate the last of the bread with canned chili, and sat at the table while rain ticked faintly on the roof. The crossed stones and cedar sprig sat just outside the window where I had moved them onto the porch rail, not to hide them, just to keep from stepping on them. I kept glancing over, trying to decide whether I was building a story out of random parts. I had spent a lifetime in practical trades because parts either fit or they didn't. This had the shape of intention, and intention implies relationship, even if tiny. That thought landed uneasy and hopeful in equal measure. I had not asked to be in relationship with anyone or anything since Anna died, because closeness had started to feel like a bill that came due with interest. The next morning broke colder, with thin ice skinning the mud puddles by the truck. June and I took coffee on the porch while a low fog moved in bands between trees. I watched chickadees bounce along the lower limbs, quick and ordinary, and felt my attention pulled toward the woods every few minutes without my consent. Curiosity had slipped in overnight and taken a seat where grief usually parked. Not replacing it, not healing it clean, just interrupting it in small, workable intervals. I found myself asking practical questions with real interest. If someone had left kindling, from where? If stones came from water, which drainage? If movement in timber could be tracked by pattern and time? The mechanic in me perked up, and that alone felt like a minor miracle. I gathered tools, then hesitated by the porch rail. Inside the cabin, I found 2 apples from my cooler, a pair of clean knit gloves I kept for dry work, and an empty metal bucket I had scrubbed the night before. I stood there feeling mildly foolish, like a grown man about to leave lunch for a ghost story. And then I set 1 apple and the gloves on the flat stump where the first kindling stack had appeared. I filled the bucket at the rain barrel with clear water and set it beside the stump. Nothing ceremonial. No note. Just useful things. June watched the whole process with patient eyes that said she would support this odd management decision, so long as breakfast happened on schedule. As we headed out to the east fence, I looked back once at the porch, the crossed stones, the stump with its small offerings, and the mist drifting through cedar trunks in quiet layers. I had come up the mountain to avoid one hard phone call and spend a weekend pretending wire tension was the only thing in my life that needed adjusting. Now I was walking into the trees, paying attention in a way I hadn't paid attention to anything in a long time. Not because I was scared, but because some careful presence had met me in silence, and I wanted, against all my prior habits, to understand it. I headed down the east line with fencing pliers on my belt and a coil of wire over my shoulder, and the mountain met me with that wet, cold smell of cedar bark and dark soil turned up by old roots. June moved ahead in little half circles, checking brush, doubling back, checking me, her nails ticking on buried stone when she crossed the old logging spur. The fog had lifted enough to show distance in layers. Alder trunks silver-grey in front, fir columns behind them, then the deeper green where light thinned out and the ground dropped toward the ravine. I kept working my usual inventory as I walked. Loose post at the bend, washout near the lower corner. One more run to tension before dark. Practical things, countable things. About 200 yards past the stump line, June slowed and fixed on a notch between 2 alders where the undergrowth opened just enough to see through. She didn't stiffen, she didn't bark. She just stood there with her tail level and her ears tipped forward like she was waiting for someone to step into view. I took 3 quiet steps and stopped beside her. The woods had gone subdued again. Not dead quiet, just narrowed like every little sound had pulled back to the edge of hearing. My own jacket sleeve sounded loud when I shifted. Then I saw movement where I had first looked right past it, a dark shape easing between trunks at maybe 60 yards. It was high. Too high for bare shoulders. Too broad for a man in rain gear. What grabbed me was how it moved. Not crashing, not shouldering through brush, but placing each step with care, pausing before each one as if it was reading the ground. It turned slightly and lowered its upper body to pass beneath a slanting branch, instead of snapping it. the branch sprang back, untouched. It reached one long arm out and steadied itself on a cedar trunk, with a flat-palmed motion so controlled it looked deliberate in a way that made my scalp tighten. I told myself it was a trick of distance. I ran through how fog and shadow can stretch proportions and make liars out of honest eyes. I fell back on language I trusted because it had gotten me through hard years. Identify variables, reduce error, do not leap to story. But I stayed rooted there with June at my knee, watching this huge dark form move across a slope that would have had me cussing and slipping. And whatever it was moved like an old hand carrying full coffee through a crowded room. Slow, balanced, respectful of every living thing in its path. June trotted forward 3 paces, stopped, and looked back at me over her shoulder. It was such a familiar look from her that it almost made me laugh. "Come on, boss. Keep up." I whispered, "Easy," though she hadn't done a thing wrong. The shape paused when she moved, angled its head toward us, and remained still. Not hidden, not advancing, just waiting. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I could also feel, plain as cold rain on my neck, that I wasn't in the presence of panic. The figure stepped back into thicker timber and was gone from sight without hurry. No dramatic rush, no sound of brush ripping, just a measured retreat that merged with the trees until all I had was alder trunks and a slope of wet fern. I stood there another full minute, listening. A kinglet started up somewhere uphill with a thin, fussy chatter, and then 2 jays traded calls across the draw as if they had been given permission to resume ordinary business. June returned and pressed against my leg. I put my hand on her shoulder and realized mine was shaking. I went back to the fence because that was what I knew how to do when my mind was overfull. I drove Staples harder than needed, re-ran the moment from every angle and found new objections each pass. Could have been a big black bear up on hind legs against a trunk. Could have been a hunter in dark layers moving side on. Could have been me needing sleep and seeing patterns where there weren't any. Every explanation had a weakness, but each was still easier to hold than what my eyes had given me. By the time I packed tools at dusk, I had argued myself into a state I can only call functional confusion. When I got back to the cabin, the stump by the porch had changed. The apple was gone, not cored or half-eaten, just gone. The gloves were gone too. The water bucket sat where I'd left it, half full, clean as before. In the gloves' place lay a short braid of meadow grass, tied in a simple loop, and beside it a smooth white feather longer than my hand. I picked up the braid and turned it in my fingers. Tight weave. Fresh, not brittle. I looked out toward the tree line and said, feeling ridiculous and sincere at once, "All right then." Inside, I made chili and ate with June's head on my boot, then drove a mile down to catch a bar of signal and called Mason like I said I would. Compressor noise and a radio played low behind him. "You alive?" he said. "Yeah. Listen, you ever see tracks up here from somebody in custom snowshoes? Like huge prints, spaced weird," he snorted once. "Custom snowshoes? Ray, what are you doing up there starting folklore?" "I'm serious. Could be elk in muck making ugly holes. Could be your eyes. You sleeping?" "Not much." "Then I'm going to keep saying this till you get mad. Eat, sleep, and don't invent mysteries in fog. Road icing tonight. If it gets bad, come down." "I hear you." He paused, then softened. "You sound less flat, though. Weirdly." I looked at the dark road ahead, mist crossing my headlights in thin bands. "Yeah," I said. "I think maybe I do." Back at the cabin, I slept in fragments, woke before first light, and sat at the table with coffee while June snored by the stove. The braid and feather sat on the windowsill above the sink. I kept glancing up at them like they were gauges I needed to monitor. Around dawn, with the room still blue from morning and my cup gone lukewarm, I let myself think the thought whole for the first time. I told myself this couldn't be real. I kept insisting big things in forests belong in stories, and I am a man who fixes injector pumps for a living. I argued that grief can warp depth perception, loneliness can make intent out of wind, and exhaustion can put a human face on stumps. I said all of that to myself while staring at that braided grass loop made by hands far larger and steadier than mine. I wanted to run this through logic until it came out clean. I wanted a known part number, a manufacturer's note, a reasonable cause. What I had was this. June trusted what she sensed. The woods didn't panic around it. I had been helped, quietly, more than once. Whatever moved out there was not hiding from me in fear, and I was no longer hiding from the possibility that my map of the world was too small. By late morning, the fog burned off and left a thin, hard light that made every wet branch shine. I worked the back boundary where old barbed wire disappeared into blackberry tangles and came up again around cedar stumps. That was where I found the first print clear enough to stop all argument. It sat in a mud patch beside my boot track, length past the toe of my size 11 by a good half again, 4 foot broad, heel deep, edges softened by moisture but shape still unmistakably foot-like. Not hoof, not paw. 5 blunt toe impressions ahead of an arch-like middle. I crouched and put my tape on it without thinking, because measure first had become religion for me. 19 inches, near enough. Depth almost 2 inches in ground where my own boot sank maybe half. I looked around and found 2 more leading upslope, each placed where roots made stable footing. Careful again. I stood there with the tape hanging from my hand and heard brush move farther in, slow and deliberate. June raised her head and gave one low woof. Not warning, more acknowledgement. On the far edge of a little opening, maybe 35 yards out, the dark figure stepped into full profile and held there. Sun through thin cloud caught the fur in brown-black tones along the shoulders. Chest wide as a barn door, long arms hanging relaxed, head set forward under a sloping brow. Bigger than any human frame I had seen in my life, yet composed, almost reserved. It did not puff up, did not stamp, did not perform. It simply stood in plain sight and looked at us with amber-brown eyes that held no heat in them, no agitation, only alert attention. Then a mule deer doe and a yearling drifted out from behind a fir to graze, heads down, maybe 30 feet from that massive body. They flicked ears and kept feeding, calm as cattle in a pasture. I watched that and felt my skepticism start to loosen in a place deeper than thought. Prey animals do not make that choice around danger. They know better than men with theories. June sat beside me, leaned lightly against my knee, and sighed. I swallowed hard and took my cap off because suddenly it felt wrong to keep it on. I didn't know what manners applied to this moment, so I offered the only ones I had. "I see you," I said quietly. "I'm not here to cause trouble." The figure tilted its head slightly, then lowered one hand and touched the top of a sapling near it. Fingers curved around the stem without bending it. A small gesture, but I understood the grammar of it. Gentle, careful, no threat. It took one backward step, then another, never breaking eye contact until brush took its outline. A moment later, I heard those measured footfalls recede down slope, each one placed with intention. I stood there a long time after it left, not crying, not shaking, just emptied of the old hard certainty that I already knew what this world contained. By the time I walked back to the cabin, I had made a second offering without overthinking it. Another apple, fresh water, and a dry square of canvas I used for kneeling in mud. I set them on the stump and went inside to split soup cans for lunch. An hour later, when I stepped out for more wood, the apple and canvas were gone. In their place sat 3 stones stacked smallest to largest, and a tiny spray of huckleberry leaves. No mess, no theatrics, just exchange. The weather turned by late afternoon. A skin of sleet ticked against the roof, and the temperature dropped fast enough to bite through my gloves. I decided to check the far back line before dark, in case ice took down more limbs overnight. June came with me, trotting close now that the ground had gone slick. We cut through second-growth fir and dropped to a game trail that ran parallel to the boundary. Halfway along, June stopped dead and stared at a thicket to our right. Her posture changed for the first time all weekend. Not fear exactly, but concern. I followed her gaze and saw movement low in the brush. A cottontail caught by a wire snare, held fast and twisting in tight, exhausted bursts. I cursed under my breath and knelt in mud. Easy, little guy. Easy! The loop was old cable anchored to a sapling, crude and mean. I got my fingers on the spring lock and tried to work it loose, but cold had numbed my hands, and rust had stiffened the mechanism. The rabbit thumped once, then froze with sides fluttering. June whined softly and paced in a tight half-circle, looking from me to the trees. I heard the careful footfalls before I looked up. Heavy weight, placed with restraint on wet ground behind me and to the left. My whole body went taut. I turned slowly and saw him at the edge of the trail, maybe 20 yards away, massive in the sleet, shoulders beaded silver by freezing rain. He stood still, hands open at his sides, watching the snare, then me. My first instinct was to grab June and retreat. My second was stranger and stronger. Stay steady. Don't make this a fear story when it isn't one. I can't get it, I said, voice rough. It's stuck. He took one step closer and waited. I leaned back from the snare and held my palms out where he could see them, then nodded toward the rabbit. Go on. What happened next was the clearest act of deliberate kindness I had seen in years, maybe ever. He crouched with astonishing control for something that size, brought 2 thick fingers to the spring lock, and compressed it with a smooth motion that made it look like soft wire. The loop loosened. He lifted it away from the rabbit's leg without jerking, without hurry, then set the cable down. The rabbit hesitated one heartbeat and bolted into fern, gone. June took one eager step after it, then stopped, looked back at him, and sat like she was in church. He gathered the snare cable, braced one end against a root, and bent the lock assembly until it warped sideways. Useless. Then he laid the mangled snare at my boots and tapped it once with a knuckle. Message received. Not here, not this. I nodded, throat tight. Thank you, I said, and meant it with my whole chest. He turned his head toward June. She rose and walked forward 3 slow paces, tail low and wagging from the base, then stopped on her own. He lowered one hand, palm open, and held it there without reaching. June sniffed the air, then gave that little satisfied huff she used when a job was done right. He withdrew his hand, rose to full height, and for a second, the scale of him against the trees hit me all over again. 8 feet, maybe more, broad and dark and entirely gentle in a sleet-grey world. Then he stepped back from the trail, moved behind a cedar screen, and was simply part of the forest again, his passage marked only by the quiet rhythm of careful footfalls fading downslope. No rush, no drama, just departure. I picked up the bent snare and carried it back, like evidence from a lesson I hadn't known I needed. By the time we reached the cabin, freezing rain was tapping hard on the metal roof, and the road beyond the gate shone dull and glassy in the failing light. I set the ruined snare on the porch rail beside the stacked stones and stood there with June pressed against my leg, both of us watching the tree line as night came on. Something in me had shifted from suspicion to trust, not blind trust, but earned. I fed the stove, fed June, hung my wet coat, and kept looking at the door as if the world outside it had become larger and kinder in the space of one cold afternoon. I stood there with my hand still on the coat hook, listening to freezing rain stitch itself across the roof, and I knew I had a choice to make before the road chose for me. Stay put and risk waking to glare ice thick enough to pin me up there 3 more days, or leave now while I could still feel the ruts under the truck tires. I checked the weather radio on the counter, wind increasing overnight, temperature dropping 6 more degrees by midnight, advisories all the way down the ridge. June had already moved to the door and sat looking back at me, waiting for whichever plan I picked. "All right," I said to her. "We're going." I packed fast but neat because that's what my hands do under pressure. Tools in the box. Wet gloves by the heater went into a side pocket. Food crate wedged behind the seat. I took one long look at Anna's note by the breaker box, touched the edge of the tape, then killed the cabin lights and stepped into sleet that felt like handfuls of sand against my face. Porch boards were slick. The gate chain had a skin of ice. I moved with my knees bent, one hand on the fender as I loaded June, and twice I had to stop and breathe slow so I didn't rush and eat gravel. The truck started hard, grumbling like an old man dragged out of bed, then settled into a rough idle. I let it warm while I scraped the windshield with a plastic scraper that kept skipping over fresh ice as fast as I cleared it. Headlights showed the first 100 feet of road and not much else, just white slanting streaks and dark tree trunks marching out of sight. I shifted into 4 low and eased forward. For the first half-mile it was manageable. Tires hunted a little, then found grip in the gravel under the ice. I kept both hands at 10 and 2 and talked myself through each bend out loud like I was training an apprentice. Don't break in the corner. Feather it. Let it settle. June lay low on the bench seat with her chin on my thigh, steadying me just by being warm and alive. At the tight switchback above the ravine, the rear end drifted 6 inches and came back. My heartbeat climbed into my throat and stayed there. By the time I reached the narrow shelf road that skirts the North Cut, sleet had turned heavier, and I could feel the truck floating more than rolling. I should have stopped. I know that now. But the thought of spending the night half-stranded on that mountain with the weather getting meaner behind me pushed me onward. I came around a shallow bend where runoff crossed the road in a black ribbon, felt the front tires hit it, and then all sense of direction loosened at once. The truck slid sideways, slow at first, then committed. I corrected left, then right, and got nothing but that sick, smooth drift of weight going where gravity wanted. The passenger side dropped. Metal thumped earth. The nose dipped hard into the ditch, and the engine stalled in a cough. Silence hit like a door shutting. I sat gripping the wheel so hard my fingers hurt, listening to ticking metal and sleet tapping the roof, and for a second I couldn't tell whether I was angry or scared, or just tired down to bone. June scrambled up and put both front paws on my chest, face in my neck, checking me. I held her and nodded into her fur. "We're okay," I said, voice shaking. "We're okay." The truck was tilted nose down, passenger side low enough that my shoulder leaned into the door. I restarted, tried rocking it. Tires spun and polished the ice under them. I got out with the shovel and tow strap, boots sliding as soon as I put weight down. The ditch was deeper than it looked from the seat, axle near buried at the front corner. I shoveled slush and gravel until my lower back burned, set the jack on a plank, tried to lift and crib. Jack kicked sideways. I reset it twice. Same result. I wrapped the strap to a cedar stump upslope, fed it through a snatch block, and pulled by hand with frozen fingers that had gone stiff and stupid. Nothing moved but me. Rain ran down my collar. Wind found the gap at my wrists. I kept at it until my breath turned ragged and my hands stopped obeying cleanly. At one point, I slipped to a knee in the ditch mud and just stayed there with my head down, feeling old in a way years alone had made familiar. I had spent 2 years telling myself strength meant carrying every load by myself. No calls when things got hard. No asking. No admitting I was at the edge. And there I was, half in a ditch on a mountain road, shaking with cold. One dog watching me like I'd lost my mind. I climbed back into the cab to warm up and sat with the engine idling, heater fan whining, wet gloves steaming on the dash. My jaw wouldn't unclench. I looked out through sleet and saw only my own headlights splashed against brush and the angled hood. I put my forehead on the steering wheel, and the words came out before I could polish them. I can't do this alone anymore, I said to nobody and everybody. I can't. I don't know how long I sat there, but I remember the exact moment the truck changed. A low shift of weight, subtle as a floorboard creak in an old house. Then the passenger side rose. Not jerked, rose, steady, controlled, like a floor jack with infinite travel lifting from under the frame rail. The truck leveled, rotated left, and settled onto all 4 tires with a soft crunch of gravel. No slam, no violent bounce, just placement. Deliberate placement. I froze with both hands on the wheel and listened to my own pulse hammering in my ears. The headlights now pointed straight down the road. The ditch sat empty at my right. Steam drifted from the hood in white threads. June stood on the seat and stared out the passenger window, tail still, ears forward, no sound. I told myself this couldn't be real. I told myself there had to be a slide under the tires, a rollover of packed ice, some mechanical explanation hidden in the dark that would return my world to known dimensions. I said maybe a stump gave way under tension. Maybe gravity did me a favor for once. Maybe exhaustion was turning ordinary physics into a campfire tale inside my head. But the truck had not lurched or spun. It had been lifted and set down the way a careful man sets glass on a bench. I knew that feel in my bones. I had moved engines with hoists for 30 years. I knew controlled weight when I felt it. Something scraped lightly near the passenger fender. Not a clawing sound, more like chain links nudged over wet gravel. I turned, wiped the fogged glass with my sleeve, and saw my tow chain slide another few inches toward the door, then stop, coiled neatly where I could reach it from the cab. I opened the door and stepped down with one hand on the frame. Moonlight had pushed through torn cloud just enough to silver the sleet and give edges back to things. 20 yards off the road, between 2 fir trunks, he stood in full view. He was bigger than any glimpse had prepared me for, broad through chest and shoulders, dark fur slick with freezing rain, breath lifting in white plumes. One huge hand hung open and low. Palm turned slightly toward me, fingers relaxed. Not a claim, not a warning, just open. His face was half-shadowed under the trees, but his eyes caught what little light there was, amber-brown and calm, and so steady it felt like being looked at by something that had no need to prove itself. June jumped down, walked to the edge of the road, and sat at my knee, without tension, gaze moving between us like she'd been expecting this meeting for days. My throat closed. I had no prepared language for gratitude this big. I took one step forward, then stopped, because closing distance felt rude. Water ran off my cap brim. My hands shook, and I let them. "Thank you," I said. It came out broken. I tried again, louder over the sleet. "Thank you." Something in me gave way right there on that road. Not fear, not shock. A locked hinge I had kept, torqued shut since the hospital, since the funeral, since every quiet meal where I pretended being fine was the same as living. I leaned against the open door and cried so hard I had to hold my ribs. I cried for Anna, for the years I had missed with Caleb while we both played tough, for all the times help stood near, and I turned away because accepting it felt like failure. June pressed her body to my shin and stayed there through all of it, breathing slow. When I could finally stand straight, he was still there, unchanged, patient in sleet and moonlight. I wiped my face with my sleeve and laughed once at myself, wet and hoarse. "I'm a grown man crying at a truck," I said. "You're not judging me, are you?" He tipped his head a fraction, almost curious, then looked toward the road downhill. A practical reminder. Go. I nodded, picked up the chain, and set it in the bed. When I looked back, he had taken 2 backward steps into shadow. He paused once, met my eyes one more time, then turned and moved between the firs with that same careful economy I had watched before, placing each foot as if the forest itself mattered. The sound of his passage faded under sleet until all that remained was wind through cedar and the small mechanical idle of my truck. No roar, no rush, no drama, just the quiet of trees closing behind a gentle giant. I got in, sat for another minute with both hands on the wheel, and whispered into the cab, "I heard you. I'm done carrying it all alone." Then I put the truck in gear and drove down the mountain at walking speed, headlights carving a narrow tunnel through rain and dark. At each turn, I expected the truck to pull hard right or reveal a bent tie rod from the ditch, but it tracked true. By the time I hit county pavement, my shoulders had unclenched a little. By the time I reached town, the sky to the east had gone from black to iron grey. My porch light at home was still on from 2 nights earlier. I parked, fed June, peeled off wet layers, and stood in my kitchen with the kettle hissing and my phone in my hand. 7:30 in the morning. Too early maybe, too late, definitely, for 2 years of silence. I called Caleb. He answered on the 4th ring, voice rough with sleep. "Dad, you okay?" "Yeah," I said, and then corrected myself. "No, I mean, I'm safe. I need to see you today." He was quiet for a breath. "What happened?" "My truck went into a ditch up high. I got out. That part is done. I need to talk to you in person." A longer pause, then, "All right, diner on River at 10? I'll be there." The Riverbend diner smelled like coffee, bacon, and old fryer oil. Same as it had when Caleb was 12 and judged pancakes by diameter instead of taste. He came in wearing a work hoodie and ball cap, beard a little fuller than the last time I'd sat across from him, shoulders carrying the same tight-set mine did when I was his age. He slid into the booth and studied my face. "You look wrung out," he said. "Fair." He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "Tell me." So I did, not as a performance, not trying to sell him anything. I started with the parcel and the kindling, the stones, the snare cut loose, the way June stayed calm. I told him about the road and the ditch and how the truck rose from one side and settled level like invisible rigging had done the pull. I told him about the figure in sleet 20 yards away, hand open, eyes steady, chain nudged to the door. I told him I cried like a man who had been thirsty for too long. He listened without interrupting, only blinking more slowly when I got to the part about the lift. When I finished, he looked down at the table and turned his spoon twice between his fingers. "Dad," he said carefully, "I don't know what to do with the creature part." "I know. I'm not calling you a liar." "I know that too." He met my eyes then, and the tenderness in his face almost undid me again. "I believe you had that night. I believe you felt helped, I believe you're telling me true as you can. That's enough. He leaned back and exhaled. I've been mad at you, he said. Not because of any mountain story, because Mom died and you went quiet like a door shut, and I kept waiting for you to call me in. You never did. I know, I swallowed. I thought I was protecting you from my mess. Truth is, I was hiding in it. He nodded, jaw tight. I did the same thing right back. We sat there with diner clatter around us, two men holding tools we should have used years earlier. I reached across and put my hand on his forearm. I miss you, I said. I miss being your dad in any real way. I don't want practical texts to be all we get. His eyes went shiny, and he laughed once, embarrassed. You're making this hard to stay grumpy about. Good. He covered my hand with his. I miss you too. We ate eggs we barely tasted and made small plans out loud so they'd stick. Sunday supper at my place. Wednesday check-in calls, even if short. He'd come up next weekend, weather permitting, help me finish the east fence and look at the washout by the lower gate. When we stood to leave, he hugged me in the parking lot hard enough to knock my cap crooked. I hadn't realized how much I needed that wait. 3 days later, sky clear and brittle cold, Caleb rode up with me to the parcel in his own pickup. The road still held ice in the shadows, but we took it slow and made it in before noon. He stepped out, stretched, and looked around the clearing. Still creepy pretty up here, he said. Mostly pretty, I said. June bounded between us, delighted by both trucks and all available boots. I showed him the repaired lines, the crushed section rebuilt, the snare I had hung twisted and useless on a nail by the shed as a reminder. I did not take him into the woods hunting-proof. That wasn't the point. We worked side by side all afternoon, handing staples, tensioning wire, grunting at frozen posts, falling into old rhythms that had gone missing. At one point he wiped his nose on his sleeve, nodded toward the porch rail and asked, "Those stones mean something?" 3 smooth river stones sat there in a little stack from my last visit. I glanced at them and then at him. "They do to me," I said. He studied my face, then nodded once. "Okay." Near dusk, we drank coffee on the porch while the temperature dropped and the first stars showed through cedar tops. June lay between us. From somewhere down in the drawer came the soft knock of branch against branch, and then the ordinary night sounds rising, one by one. Caleb didn't ask for more explanation. He just sat with me in the quiet, shoulder-brushing mine through heavy coats, and that simple closeness felt like being handed back part of my life. Winter settled in for real after that, not as a montage, but as specific days, with specific work. A Tuesday, where I changed fuel filters in single-digit wind, and still made the Wednesday call because we said we would. A Sunday where Caleb came over and we burnt the first batch of biscuits together, laughed and ordered pizza, without calling it failure. A Friday where I drove up the mountain with chains in the bed, cleared branches from the lane, and found a fresh braid of grass on the stump beside the bucket I kept filled. I left apples when I had them, carrots when I didn't, and once a pair of heavy wool socks sealed in a dry bag because the thought of bare feet on snow made my own feet hurt. Some visits held no signs at all beyond tracks blurred by weather. Some held small exchanges that felt both ordinary and sacred. A cluster of huckleberry twigs on the porch step, split cedar kindling stacked under tarp after a wet week, a line of prints paralleling mine at the edge of the clearing, never crowding, always keeping respectful distance. I saw him twice more at range through winter, each time just long enough for recognition. A dark, towering form between firs in dawn mist, still as a post, while June sat and watched. Another evening at last light, moving along the upper ridge with slow, deliberate steps, pausing when I raised a hand, then continuing on his way. No demands, no ownership, presence, and then absence. By March, mud season returning, my house looked lived in again. Not perfect, real. Dishes dried on the rack because I cooked actual food. Caleb's spare boots by the door from a Saturday visit. A calendar with call nights marked in black pen and mostly kept. On my front porch to the left of the swing, I placed 2 crossed river stones with a cedar sprig tucked beneath. I set them there one clear morning and stood back, feeling a little foolish and entirely certain. Not for display, not for convincing anyone. A private witness to one night on a mountain road when help arrived, in a form I had no framework for and asked nothing in return. Mason noticed them first time he stopped by for coffee. "New yard art?" he said, nodding at the stones. Something like that. He watched me over the rim of his mug. "You doing better?" "Yeah." "Good. Keep doing whatever this is." I planned to. I never became a preacher about what happened. I didn't start chasing tracks with cameras or trying to drag the whole town into my memory. Most people don't need my story, and some wouldn't know where to set it down if I gave it to them. But when Caleb and I drive up together now and the road narrows and the fog sinks into the ravine, there is a place on that north cut where I still slow a little and glance to the passenger side. Not from fear, from gratitude. Something carried my truck out of the ditch and was gone before I could look up full. That sentence used to sound like the kind of thing I would dismiss in 10 seconds and get back to work. Now it is simply true in my life, alongside talk specs and weather radio and all the other facts I trust. The world I live in did not get less practical after that night. It got wider. It got kinder in a way I had stopped believing possible. And when cold rain hits the roof and the house goes quiet, I no longer mistake silence for being alone.